do it for and be really deliberate about it. So I hope you'll have patience with me as I try to talk through everything and make sure that I'm covering all the building blocks for the different points of policy. Just to give a little background on myself. So I'll be talking today about the proposed budget cuts and the potential impact on Medicaid for us as family members of people with Down syndrome and other disabilities. I have a 25-year-old son with Down syndrome, Andy, who is super cool, much cooler than I ever hoped to be. And then I have two younger daughters who are 23 and 18. And my 18-year-old just graduated on Saturday. And that's part of the reason we're doing this during the day is every evening is absolutely full of stuff in Maycember. So there's that. And I'm also I work for the Genetic Support Foundation. I am the Development Director working on research and in the health space. And also I am the supervisor of our National Center for Prenatal and Postnatal Resources and do a lot of support for new and expectant parents learning about a diagnosis of various disabilities. So that's kind of my personal background. I just got my doctorate in public health last year from Georgia State, and my focus was disability and health. So I did a lot of my dissertation was a policy analysis of how to improve diagnosis experiences for families. So that is fun. So I'm gonna give a little bit of a background on this bill. So it's a budget bill. I put the text of the bill here, and when I talk about things, I am talking specifically about primary text. I'm not talking about any news interpretation of it. I went back and was looking through the bill itself. And I'm putting that in the presentation so that we can upload these slides and you can look it all up yourself too. Double check me. I am not an expert in economic policy, but so I had to look up everything. So what the bill aims to do is have tax cuts for individuals and businesses to retain some tax cuts that were passed in the last Trump administration. The goals are a reduction in tax. So that's what they're looking at as their primary goal. What ends up happening is you end up having a reduction in tax income if you're reducing taxes. That's just how it goes. And we do see some increased spending in other areas in this bill, increases in defense, immigration reform, and Trump child savings accounts. But that also means that there's reduced spending in other areas. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is some of those proposals in reduced spending. And President Trump and members of Congress have all promised that there will be no cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, or Social Security. And I gave a link to the White House press release about that. But we're going to look at how some of and I will say that there is no specific, cuts to Medicaid for people that say it's a cut to Medicaid for people with disabilities in this bill, or a cut to Social Security, or a cut to Medicare. However, some of the cuts that would happen would end up having a ripple effect that would inevitably cause some of those things. So it's important to kind of look at what the impact of some of the things would be. And where is the bill now? Just to kind of let you know, it's passed the House. So it's gone through. It has currently been sent to the Senate. The Senate can then decide whether they're going to pass it or they're going to make amendments to it. It seems like they probably will make amendments to it. And then the president signs a bill. You just kind of think about that whole, I don't know if the rest of you were born in the 70s or 80s and watched the Schoolhouse Rocks. I'm just a bill. So it's in the Senate part. So I want to talk a little bit about who uses Medicaid. So we have people below a certain income limit qualify for Medicaid, and that can be because of Medicaid proper, because they fall below the poverty line, or because of Medicaid expansion, where it increased the income limit in some places. We have a different version of Medicaid expansion that passed last year. I am not an expert on that, but we don't have the regular type of Medicaid expansion in Georgia. Children whose parents fall below certain income limits also qualify. Foster children, pregnant women, Again, below a certain income level. Individuals in long-term care, you might hear of elderly family members who utilize Medicaid. That would be for nursing home care. Sometimes that happens. Medical emergencies. If someone has really high medical costs that outweigh their income, you can get emergency Medicaid approval. And then people with disabilities. And it may be that people are accessing it for healthcare as people with disabilities, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Or they could have a Medicaid waiver, which would be like our Katie Beckett Medicaid waiver, home and community-based service waivers, independent care waiver program, and community care services program. And just to kind of give you a little bit of background on me, so we have used different types of Medicaid at different points in our life. Andy had Katie Beckett Medicaid when he was under 18, and we had a primary health insurance some of that time. And then Medicaid, Katie Beckett Medicaid covered, therapies that our insurance didn't cover and some of those things. And then we ended up qualifying when there was a drop. I think it was when the tech bubble burst. We were just new students out of college. Andy was only like a few years old, and our income dropped, and we ended up qualifying for Medicaid proper, which was really a hard financial time, and we dug our way out of it after a year. But that was tough, and that was a time we needed it because of income level. And now Andy has the home and community-based services waiver, and we were on the waiting list for 17 years to get it. And it wasn't until he turned 22 and went out of the school system that he ended up getting approved. So I understand this from a policy perspective, but I'm living it with all of you guys too, and then who uses Medicare? Because sometimes people get those two mixed up between Medicaid and Medicare. Medicare it's a federal health insurance program, typically utilized by Americans age 65 and older. Once you start regular Social Security, that's usually what you're getting, and certain working people with disabilities. So you hear of SSDI, that is what people with that's Social Security disability income. They have worked for enough quarters that they qualify for getting that type of Social Security disability. And they get Medicare with that, okay? That's in comparison. I'm going to skip back. Well, no, I cover it later. I cover it here. All right. And this is a quote from my friend, Roxanne Romanek, who runs the Down syndrome organization, or used to, she just retired, in North Dakota. And it's, if you know one state Medicaid program, then you know one state Medicaid program. They are, customized for the state, but there are some common federal requirements. In Georgia, supplemental security income, which is what most of our young people with Down syndrome end up qualifying for when they're 18. It's about $950 a month right now. Try to live on that. You cannot, but it does help. And so that once our young adults turn 18, their income isn't determined by our income. It's determined by what they earn. And most of them qualify for supplemental security income. And in Georgia, that is tied to Medicaid, and that allows us to get Medicaid health insurance. Most Georgians with Down syndrome are approved after age 18. And then optional Medicaid waivers cover additional services. They can cover health insurance. I want to make that clear. But they also cover additional services like personal care and respite, behavioral supports, specialized therapies, supported employment, transportation, and community living support. And so, like for our Medicaid waiver, we use it to pay support staff because my husband works full time. I work like full time. We work more than full time. And we also want Andy to be able to get out into the community and do the things he loves to do. He coaches lacrosse. He works part-time at Publix. He's trying to start a photography business. He's doing lots of things, but he also needs lots of help. He can't really manage a schedule on his own. He can't do transportation on his own. And he has to have a cruise director and a cruise coordinator. And it requires all of that to help him have the fulfilling life that he has. And so we definitely have used supported employment. We definitely use transportation. We've definitely used community living support. And those are all the things that are part of his waiver. In Georgia, there are some people who get approved below 22 because they have really high needs. But I would say the majority of the people I know don't get approved until 22 or over, because that's when you kind of hit that cliff with school ending and you don't have school all day. So that's when that usually gets utilized. And working adults with Down syndrome may end up qualifying through Medicare, through Social Security disability income, if they work enough quarters and enough hours in those quarters. So most of our folks, I would say, use Medicaid, but there are some, I do definitely have friends who end up switching to Medicare because they've worked long enough. So both of those matter a lot to our population. So how's Medicaid funded? It's a combination of federal and state dollars, with federal matching a percentage of the state contributions. So for fiscal year 2025, and they call it the FMAP, which is the federal matching, amount. And in Georgia, our FMAP was 66% in 2025, meaning the federal government covers approximately 2/3 of the state's Medicaid service cost, while Georgia covers the remaining 34%. And every state has a customized FMAP percentage based on need. And I will tell you that our southern states tend to have a higher FMAP because we have higher poverty levels in southern states. I also I've worked for University of Kentucky as part-time staff for a long time. And I know that Kentucky, because of some of those rural mining areas, really, they have one of the highest FMAP percentage matches. And so I think what's confusing to people is that some aspects of Medicaid are required, or some categories of people who receive Medicaid, it's a required expenditure. So it's required to provide Medicaid for people at a certain, under the poverty level, for example, or children in foster care. And that's really important. Those are people who need health insurance. But our Medicaid waivers, because the state basically is what the requirement would have been is the institutional model. So that would be what the state would be obligated to pay for. But we've advocated hard to not have institutions anymore. And I have a family member who lived in one of those institutions, my dad's cousin, and he was institutionalized in Milledgeville in 1970. He was born in 1960, and he lived there till 2003, when shortly after the Supreme Court Olmstead decision said that if people could live outside an institution, they should be given that opportunity. And so because we have really pushed away from that institutional model, most of them have even closed. That's not even really an option for us. But the Medicaid waivers, so the home and community-based service waivers, Katie Beckett made waivers, those are optional because the state has said, we want to do something other than the institutional model, but it's not, so that's not the required thing. So we kind of depend on the generosity of the federal government and the state to make that a priority. And some states make it a priority and some don't. In Georgia, we're kind of in the middle. I'll tell you, Texas is the worst. They've got a waiting list of 311,532 for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And it's because they just simply don't prioritize it and don't fund it. So the state doesn't pay and the federal government also doesn't match it. When the state prioritizes it, then the feds match it. And then there are some states with no waiting lists at all, like North Dakota and Vermont. They fully fund them and they do prioritize that. So this is why we have waiting lists. And I didn't really get that for a long time. Like, why are there even waiting lists? Like, this seems to be the most vulnerable population. Why wouldn't this be a priority for everybody? And that's why, because they're doing something different. And should we change the federal law so that that's not the default model? I would 100% support that. But that's not what we have right now. So what could be the impact of the big, beautiful bill on Medicaid. So cuts to Medicaid are proposed in the bill, and that did happen. But, the assertion by the administration is that they're just trying to target fraud and waste. Okay. And so that is happening. And the budget proposes $625 billion in Medicaid cuts over 10 years. And the number of uninsured is expected to grow by 7.6 million, according to the Congressional Budget Office. And these are all numbers, again, where I'm citing the government source. And with that, 7.6 million, it'll actually, some people you'll hear say 10 million, but the thing is that there is a contingency in there, I think of around, 2.4 million, where it's people who either have Medicaid in 2 states and they're just reducing them to having it in 1 state, or they have Medicare and Medicaid and they're just reducing it to the 1, which is how it's supposed to be anyway. So basically they're just fixing that piece of it. But these other 7.6 million are people who are going to lose what they already have. So that is the plan. And the money saved from that is going toward the tax cuts. It's not going to stay in the program and have more money to go toward people with disabilities. It's going toward the tax cuts. So another one of the problems, and this is something Cheryl gave me way too much credit. I get all the I know from other people who are a lot smarter than I am. But we have, Allison Barkoff, who is she's a Georgian and I've known her forever, but was also the head of the administration on community living for people with disabilities, was explaining that the other key provision that's going to be really difficult for states is that the bill proposes limitations on provider taxes. And those so the provider taxes are where the states can determine the taxes on hospitals, nursing homes, that sort of thing. And then the federal government provides a percentage of matching. And when we have a shortfall in the state budget, the state will often adjust those taxes to compensate for that. And so what this bill does is it puts a limitation on the ability for them to raise those taxes. Now, they can still charge them, but they can't raise them and they can't adjust based on need. And so that's an issue because that can really hurt state budgets when they have shortfalls. And the other thing that it does is it adds a lot of administrative requirements that could make it very add a huge administrative burden. So say, they're requiring, and this is one of the things it requires. So people of Medicaid expansion are going to have to reapply, apply for redetermination every 6 months instead of every year. And so you have to have staff who are doing that. And I don't know about you guys, but like whenever I'm applying for all of these things and trying to call people, it's really hard to get a hold of somebody to answer your questions and to, do some of that work. And that's because they already have a really big caseload. So when you ask them to do even more work, it's going to be even harder to get a hold of somebody. And it can cause real issues. We had, in this past year, I mentioned my dad's cousin. So after COVID, there was, they kind of put a hold on redeterminations because of all that was going on with COVID. And then they needed everybody to do that afterwards. And Georgia was pretty heavy-handed about, we're going to have to get all those redeterminations done. Well, my dad's cousin is, aging. He's got very significant intellectual disability. He lives in a host home. And he's at the point where he needs assistance with, a lot of basic hygiene type things, even. And they ended up sending him the redetermination letter to his old address. He and his roommate, who's also significantly disabled, they both got kicked off Medicaid for, I think it was like 6 to 9 months. And these are men who are clearly disabled. There is no question. They absolutely need those services. And it was their service providers and, us as family members who are having to fight to get them put back on the rolls. And it was because of the administrative burden that was added, and not because they were undeserving or anything like that. So state funding for Medicaid waivers, there's a real ripple effect when federal funds are cut because those federal funds supplement the state funds. And in fact, by saying that they're putting the limit on the provider taxes that states can charge, that ends up, and get the federal matching rate, that ends up really restricting those state funds. So states really only have two options at that point, right? They can either raise taxes, state taxes, which a lot of people don't want to do, or they cut the optional stuff. And the optional stuff is our Katie Beckett and home and community-based service waivers. So the potential impact on state and local services is that we have a reduction in caregiver services. Some states will say, for example, and they won't always do it where they're saying, oh, we're going to cut Medicaid slots. What they'll say is, we're not going to allow, for example, friends and family to serve, not friends, but family to serve as caregivers. Well, and some people hear that and they're like, gosh, why are family members even getting any money for doing that? And the issue is, especially right now, there's a direct support provider shortage. And a lot of times you can't find anybody else. So, maybe it's your grandma, maybe it's a sibling or someone who has some extra time that they're able to devote to doing that when you can't find anybody else. So it means people end up losing services because even though the state hasn't said, yeah, we're cutting slots, they know that people are going to drop off because they've changed the requirements. And as a matter of fact, Idaho is doing that right now. That is exactly what they're doing. You also could see a loss in community services, budgets being lowered, individual budgets of people being lowered, or they can straight up cut slots. That is an option. Sometimes they try to obfuscate it, but that can be done in some places. Medical equipment, you may see a loss of day programs. Like I know, so I've got a very good friend who's also been advocating with me, and she's got two sons who are profoundly disabled. They have Jacobson syndrome, and she's given me permission to share her story. Just want to clarify that. But both of her guys are in day programs, and she asked the head of the day program if they, what percentage of their clientele use Medicaid waivers. And it was 95%. So if you end up having people lose their Medicaid, these day programs can't stay open. And so it's that they're not available for anyone, regardless of income, if people aren't able to access them through their Medicaid waivers. We also could be looking at a loss of employment support. And that's really obviously important because we want our loved ones to be engaged and employed as much as possible and to give them that support. And then also the Medicaid healthcare supplements that we receive, like, with the Katie Beckett, with our therapies. I know we ended up having to move to Georgia from Utah because Utah did not fund Katie Beckett Medicaid waivers for anyone, but honestly, you had to be on event. I mean, it was very strict. And so when we moved to Georgia, part of our motivation was to be by family, but also because we needed access to the therapies because they told us Andy would never run if he didn't have more physical therapy. And we knew he had greater capacity than that. And he wasn't talking and he wasn't getting enough speech therapy. And so we had to move somewhere where that could happen. And we don't want Georgians with disabilities to have to move away from their families in order to go to a different state to get that covered. And, that's part of the benefit we have by having that federal matching amount. So I want to give some points of clarification. This bill could have been worse, for sure. That when you hear, and sometimes you will hear people saying, oh, they're going to require people with disabilities to have the redetermination every 6 months. I actually looked that up, and specifically in the bill, and only people receiving Medicaid expansion will have to do that redetermination every 6 months. Ours will still be annually, but like I said before, the administrative burden that causes can have a ripple effect and do other things to our population. The work requirement, also does not specifically apply to our population. It does, like it says in there, it does not apply to people who are aged and disabled under the Social Security Act. So that's also one that shouldn't apply based on that definition. Although one of my concerns that I haven't been able to get anyone to answer the question about is, what about people waiting for SSI approval? Because you could have a person with a significant disability whose parents were using SSI, SSI for young people, where they got Medicaid, and parents don't have, a primary insurance provider. And then they turn 18 and they've got to get on adult SSI, or maybe someone gets injured or disabled and then needs to apply for SSI. And usually you have to wait like a year or two and they end up back paying you. So if you're on it for a year or two though, and you're significantly medically complex person, are you just not supposed to go to the doctor during that time? Like, because you couldn't work, but you also couldn't meet the work requirement, and you haven't been declared disabled by the Social Security Act yet. So, and we had this, we were one of those people who fell into the cracks many years ago when I was, I had COBRA because I had quit work to stay home with my babies when they were little, and I was pregnant with my second one. And we had applied for, we were using COBRA, which is that extension of your health insurance that you can purchase after you've left a job. And they said you can get an additional 11 months if you have someone on the policy who's disabled. And I checked before I got pregnant, and I said, I've got this the son with Down syndrome. Does that qualify? And they said, yes, it does. Okay, so I got pregnant under that understanding. And then come to find out, the only way to prove disability to get the COBRA extension was if he had a Social Security award determination letter. And we couldn't get that because our income was too high at the time. And even the Social Security Administration said, and they wrote us a letter and they said, were it to be determined just by his disability, he would qualify. But because he has parents who earn above that amount, he can't get it. We can't give him Social Security, and they wouldn't give us that COBRA extension. And so I ended up having to get induced because my insurance was going to end April 1st and my baby was due April 6th. And so people end up making these nutty medical decisions or not getting the medical care they need, sometimes because of these administrative hurdles that have been put in there. So just some things to consider. Other issues of concern, just to kind of, think about in general, is that it really, for a lot of people, depends on the prioritization of people with disabilities by the state. So if you have a state that thinks our population is important, then you are much more likely to be able to access these Medicaid waivers. And if the states end up losing access to the federal funding that they need in order to make that feasible, then it ends up kind of reducing the prioritization of our population. And so that's an issue. I think also we need to consider some of our tax priorities. And I'm so sorry that's grayed out, but it's because I gave you a link and I wanted you to be able to follow it because, for example, there's a provision in the bill, and I was reading through a bunch of different stuff. It's like increasing the death gift tax exemption from 10 million to 15 million, right? And I think we need to I would like to see the senators have a lot more heart-to-heart look at that. And it's like, do we really care about increasing the death tax exemption more than we care about funding some of these provisions that help with Medicaid? Personally, that's more important to me. Do I want to keep middle-class tax cuts? Yeah, sure. Let's, as much as we can, but let's look at some of these places where we might be prioritizing things that aren't as helpful for middle-class Americans. And then overall, another issue of concern with the budget is that it is estimated to add an additional 3.1 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. And that's according to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. And so it doesn't actually achieve, I think, the goal of a lot of conservatives who originally were envisioning what this bill would do. I'm going to come at this too and just give a little bit of my personal positionality with this, is that I've always considered myself a fairly moderate person. I think I end up being kind of fiscally conservative, while at the same time, I would say I'm the old-fashioned compassionate conservative back in the day, which that was a thing back in the day that people used to say. And I think that the majority of people who live around me in Cherokee County here, we're 70% conservative, right? I think the majority of them do not want to hurt people with disabilities. And I think the majority of them do not want to increase the deficit. And I don't think this bill accomplishes either of those things, because it would cause potential harm given the ripple effects to people with disabilities, and it will increase the deficit. So what was the impact of the big beautiful bill on Medicare? So because of the deficit issue, and when you have deficits over a certain amount, it triggers reductions in Medicare. So even though Medicare cuts aren't in the bill, the deficit that would be caused would automatically trigger those reductions in Medicare, amounting to about $490 billion over 10 years as required by the Statutory Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2010. And again, I've got a link to the CBO letter indicating that that is the case. And because what it does is they have to make a maximum of a 4% cut to Medicare. And that would be required given the level of deficit that this budget would cause. And even with that, it still wouldn't cover the amount of deficit that there would be. And so that's something too. So it won't just be Medicaid that's cut, it would also be Medicare. And in general, so I'm just covering just a small slice with the health stuff. Some other issues that the disability community has with the bill is the special education block grants. And why do they care about that, right? That is for a couple of reasons. One is that when you issue block grants to the states, it doesn't allow for some of the growth when there's additional state funding needs, or even allowing for going up and down with that. The other is that you kind of lose the ability to supervise those funds. And you really want to make sure that states are abiding by IDEA as much as possible. And I think we can all agree that this system is not currently perfect. I have a ton of recommendations I would recommend to change, including with the health. First thing I would do, and I'm going to say it because I'm a private person and I can say what I want to say, I would get rid of the mobile caregiver app. I hate that thing so much, and they must be spending $1 gajillion on that. But there are ways I can think to cut funding, but it needs to be done with a scalpel and not a sledgehammer. And so and you want to make sure you're still having that supervisory capability to make sure they're abiding by IDEA. Because even as broken as it can be sometimes, it is still better than it was, 50 years ago when my dad's cousin was coming around, right? We've made a lot of progress, but I think we would all agree there's still more progress that can be made, but it's not going to happen by cutting funds for those services and lacking supervision. So then there are other K-12 education cuts, proposal to cut the parent training centers like Parent to Parent of Georgia, school voucher expansion, which, there can be some good in that for people where if they want to access private school, but the problem is that a lot of private schools don't take our kids. And so what ends up happening is that the way our school system set up is, we take a certain amount of dollars, each school system gets a certain amount of dollars per kid. Our kids actually cost a lot more than the average kid usually, and other kids cost less. So if people take out all the lower cost kids and we only have the kids who have the most need, then our public school systems are going to be even worse for them. And so that's one of the concerns with the school voucher expansion. The other big concern is the elimination of funding for the programs that used to fall under the Administration for Community Living, which has been so important in research and also for programs for people with disabilities. It would cut the University Centers for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. We have 2 in Georgia. We have Georgia State University Center for Leadership on Disability. They started the Learn the Science program for autism. They're amazing. We also have one in Athens. They would also cut funding for protection and advocacy, like our Georgia Advocacy Office. I put accountability, but I meant Georgia Advocacy Office, and our developmental disabilities councils. And these are all ways that our families learn to be advocates and to get the advocacy they need. Again, with protection and advocacy, when we moved back to Georgia, we didn't know where my dad's cousin lived. And it really bothered me that I'd heard about this man who was sent to an institution who could have been like my son, and that nobody knew where he was. Nobody had contact with him. It was through Dottie at the Protection and Advocacy. It's gonna make me cry. Through Dottie that I found him. And these are people who do jobs that nobody else is doing, and nobody else has access to that information. We cannot lose them. And it was through her that I found him, and we were able to reestablish a relationship and have him come to our home for holidays instead of hadn't been visited in 20 years. So these are real people. And I think there are all kinds of criticisms. We'll hear about these concerns. And I want to address some of those. One is, why are you overreacting? They promise they're not going to cut Medicaid and Medicare. Don't overreact. And to that I say, I truly hope you're right. I 100% hope you're right. But it never hurts to lobby for people with disabilities. There are people in there lobbying every day for every special interest under the sun. And we need to be in there making sure that our voices are heard, so that it reminds our legislators of the power of the disability voting bloc, so that when inevitably there are these budget wranglings back and forth, they're like, I need to make sure that I pay attention to this one. This population of people, because they have needs that maybe others don't understand. The other thing is that a lot of times our legislators don't know about some of these different services we use. Because when I went to talk to our representative staff, he had heard about the Katie Beckett waiver, but I had never heard about home and community-based services waiver. And to be fair, like, they are big fans and of our local day program that my friend Lindsay's sons use. And he was like, really? So those waivers pay for that program? I had no idea. And so unless we're in there telling them, sometimes they'll cut stuff just because they're like, I didn't think it was I thought that was a waste. I thought that was just an extra thing. And they don't realize how vital it is. So I think that's one way to kind of address that concern. Also, reducing fraud. Some people will say reducing fraud and waste will leave more money for people with disabilities. But that's not what the bill says. The bill says that that money saved is going to be used to fund tax cuts. So it doesn't mean you're going to increase the pool that's going to be available. It means those are going to go to tax cuts. So that's not really even where the bill says the money's going to go. And other people will say it's just getting rid of fraud and waste, and it's not aimed at people with disabilities. And I think there's an element of truth in that. I mean, like I said, there are some legitimate, like, people who have duplicate coverage between the states or whatever. Great. We should be getting rid of extra things we're paying for that we don't need to be. But I think what we have to be really careful about is the ripple effect. The Medicaid, and that's that example of that Medicaid redetermination in Georgia. Like, they thought, hey, we're just going to get rid of the people on the rolls who are dead or who don't use it anymore. But I know and I don't know, I mean, I know a lot of people, but I don't know that many people. I know 3 men with profound disabilities who got kicked off, and they should not have been. So it can cause a ripple effect. And then imagine, it's the administrative burden, the stress and the heartache for those families trying to get them back on. And so that's a lot. So what can you do? And I'm gonna leave the rest of the time for questions. You can be contacting your governor and state representatives about your concerns regarding the impact on the state budget. Because sometimes when they won't listen to us, and at this point, we don't really, our senators are not going to be voting for this bill. So, but we might have senators and we might have the president who would listen to the governors and our state representatives. So those are good people to talk with. Also, sharing our stories with the senators so that they can share our stories as they're talking about why they're going to vote, how they're going to vote. And then also sharing on social media from a balanced perspective, not demonizing people, because everybody's a hero in their own story. Nobody's trying to be a villain, I don't think. But I think but sometimes people make decisions that can really hurt other people. And so I think to share on social media, with loving kindness, as my son Andy would say, with loving kindness, your personal stories about the value of Medicaid and to share some of this information. So I'm going to go ahead and stop talking because I covered most of what I know how to say, and I'll try to answer any questions. And if I don't, I'll help you look it up. Yeah, Amanda.
Hey, thank you so much for this great presentation. I was wondering, when would all of this go into effect if and when this bill is passed? Is it going to be like an immediate thing, or is it going to be like boiling the frog and we won't feel it for a while? Or what's your sense of the timeline?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the big compromises in the last minutes of the bill was when to implement some of these cuts, and they moved from, I think, like 2028 or something like that to 2026. So it would be pretty soon that the federal cuts would go into effect. It would be pretty fast. We then would have to see how that impacts the states. So it generally is boiling a frog, like, because it's that it moves from the federal cuts to then what does the state decide to do based on that, and then how do they decide to do it? You kind of have to pay attention to. It's like, are they actually telling me we're cutting Medicaid waiver slots, or are they changing the rules to make it harder for people to qualify or easier to get kicked off? So I think that's where we need to pay attention to when that frog is turning. That's a great question, and one that I don't have the definite answer to, but those are generally the litmus tests that you'll want to look for.
I don't think anybody has those answers yet, but I think that they're coming sooner rather than later for sure. I mean, he wants done what he wants done. Um, so Stephanie, I can't even begin to, and please, y'all, we have more time for questions if y'all have some. I can't imagine having a better presentation. I mean, I think that from the perspective of a mom and a professional and all of that, I think that you just bring such a different perspective, and it was so well done that I learned so much. I'm not sure I understand still the provider tax. Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, and there's actually a Georgetown article that I linked to about that. And I will say too that I am a novice. I am not an expert on this particular piece. That the provider tax basically is the state gets to charge hospitals. It's not like taxing your doctor. It's taxing the institutions. So they get to set the taxes that are charged for hospitals, nursing homes, those kinds of things. And then there is a percentage amount that the federal government matches for that. And so if there's a lean year, they might charge some higher taxes on that, on those institutions. And what the law is saying is that they're basically kind of grandfathered in where they're at, but they can't adjust it. They can't adjust it higher. And sometimes states will need to do that. And so it limits their capacity to bring in income.
Okay. And I'm just going to keep asking questions until somebody else jumps in. So we've passed the House. Now, are we seeing any movement on the Senate side, and that's really where people should focus, correct?
I mean, I think in our case, it's those three things that we can do, but I think broader outside of Georgia, yes, it's focusing on the senators, and helping them understand. And I will say that we have seen, just among advocates that I know who've gone and talked to like Senator Moran and, you know, some of the GOP senators who are more involved in disability issues, and they're, you know, there's definitely a growing understanding of how we use these Medicaid waivers. And there are certain things that I'm going to be honest about. Like, I don't think the GOP is going to back away from the work requirement for Medicaid. I don't think that is a reasonable or a realistic expectation. But I think what could happen is you could alert them to, hey, there are these people who fall in this donut hole who have applied for disability, who haven't been approved yet. Can you make sure to close that hole? And so I think that that's probably a more realistic expectation. And so as we raise these questions too, in advocacy circles, and the constituents of those senators are bringing it to them, I think that helps them.
I want to just see, I don't know if Kim Knight has the ability to turn on her camera and her voice.
My camera, no. My voice, yes.
Do you want to give 1 minute about what you just did and, you know, kind of represented all of us up in DC?
Yeah, hi, Stephanie.
Hey, Kim.
How are you?
I'm so good. It's
Good.
so
Hi,
good to
Cheryl.
hear your voice.
I'm in the car. I'm on 23 minutes away from Savannah. So we took our boys up to DC, and I will say our people, we have Ossoff, we have Warnock, so they are Democrats, and they're much more open on that side. We did not, but we also spoke with Cheryl, what's his name, out in Savannah.
I don't know. Keep going.
It's the Holtons, whoever they talk to. Buddy.
Yeah.
Buddy
Carter.
Yes, but Buddy Carter, yes, he is a Republican, but he is also very, very familiar with the Holtons and their struggles. So it was really great for our kids actually got to talk. And when the kids talk, people listen. And Ben, the brother of, he looked at me towards the end of our Warnock meeting, and he goes, "Mom, you forgot to say this." I said, "Well, then go right ahead." And Ben was even knowing exactly what he was going to say about people duplicating their SSI or their Medicaid, and them getting double the money and double the resources rather than spreading those resources out to another family. So it really does make a huge difference, and we have been corresponding with them back and forth. And it really was a great experience for all of us. My husband found his voice, and it was really neat. And I do believe that they actually listen to you if you can get them, and not always just their office staff. Their office staff is usually fantastic, but when you can get them for at least 5 minutes, it makes such a difference.
And here's the truth, and I know I've spoken it to, you know, most everybody, is I'm certainly an advocate for people with Down syndrome and people with disabilities, and Howie Rosenberg is certainly an amazing advocate. But people, quite often, senators will look, you know, I go in and I tell your stories all the time, and I shared actually stories this weekend, but they look at me like it's my job. They need to hear personal stories. And the reason I wanted Kim to speak, and Stephanie and all the others, and Heidi, is because they need to hear your story as you live it. And that I still believe is some of the most impactful work that we can do. And I want to kind of take you know, when I first started, even, you know, going to the ropes and all that kind of stuff, it's very scary. But I've watched Kim, who we took to DC, I think 8 years ago, and she wouldn't say a word, to now she's going on her own. And it's if you ever want to reach out to any of us, if you want to figure out how to share your stories, please let us help you. And we'll push you towards the ropes and we'll push you towards these meetings. But it's so important. And one of the reasons, again, that I wanted Stephanie to do it is because she has all these perspectives that a lot of people don't have, and she has the expertise. And I've been watching her. Please, if it's okay, Stephanie, I can push, your Facebook page. But I'm telling y'all, national organizations are sharing her information because she does have all of these perspectives. And I share her stuff quite often, and I know DSAA does. So please make sure that you're following people that are she's not giving you all the answers. She doesn't want to give you the answers. She just wants you to be educated. Am I right, Stephanie?
Oh yeah, and I wouldn't claim to know all the answers in the least, but I do think that because it's obviously a really personal for us, I can't really work, and Andy really can't have the quality of life he has unless we, unless this remains an option. And so I'm personally motivated. I've got some professional experience in it, but I'm definitely going deeper than I normally do. And so I feel like I'm having to look up everything. And, I was reading the text of the bill and then Googling the title of the act of the chapter and looking it up. And so I really try to be thorough that way. But I guess too, as far as sharing your story and not being too intimidated about that, really, like, 3 sentences, just write your 3 sentences and you can share that with whoever, just about why. I mean, if you're using Katie Beckett, if you're using home and community-based service, long-term service, whatever it is, just write your 3 sentences about what it means to your family. And that is huge. Send a picture. Pictures really get people to see you as a person and not as just a random message. And
Hey, Stephanie, can I ask a favor of you? And then I'm going back on mute. Could you send them to Cheryl or whoever bullet points of what you think are the top areas that we need to include in our emails or our phone calls?
yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you very much for doing this, Cheryl and Stephanie and Heidi, somewhere in there.
Thanks, Kim.
I was also going to say, don't underestimate the local office of any of your representatives. So we couldn't get up to DC. Like Kim was able to do that this year. Lots of years we can't do that, right? But all of our representatives and senators have local offices here in Georgia. I know my representative's office is actually a kitty corner across the street from my husband's office. And so make appointments with their staff there if you can't get up to DC, just to have them see, again, you as a person, and to be able to make that connection. Because, when we went to Representative Loudermilk's office, we were able to say, oh yeah, Lindsay goes to the state program. The lady who runs that goes to your church. And you start making all these community connections. And it's like, it also puts a little bit, I think, more pressure on somebody when they know that it's like, oh, this is actually going to hurt this lady I go to church with. And I know she does good work for our community. So it adds some more positive pressure, I think.
And certainly about that bill, but also don't forget your local state representatives and your state senators and even your councilmen. Just make sure that your voice is getting heard. But building those relationships, Heidi has taught me that a lot. She's built many relationships. And just to give you an example, is we have somebody in our community, I won't name him, but he votes. And let's just say that for Senate Bill 55, if y'all don't know that had gotten passed, but he didn't necessarily agree with voting no, but he had so many calls from so many constituents for it that he voted the way his constituents wanted him to. And so they are listening, they do count, they do watch. And so don't underestimate, like she said, the governors. We got to make sure that Governor Kemp understands where we're coming from. But the other side is, and Stephanie, I'll let you finish on this, is it's exhausting because y'all have full-time jobs or taking care of your kids and I think that's where a lot of our families get overwhelmed is, oh my God, I have to do one more thing. Can you speak to that really quickly?
Yeah, and I think there are times in life when you have to do more and less, right? More or less, depending on what your circumstances are. I think at a minimum, they do count the number of calls that they get. So even if
Mm.
you call and you just say, you know, I am really concerned about cuts to Medicaid, and this would really hurt my family. If you even just call and say that, it takes 2 minutes. And whenever I post stuff, I give you the phone number to call even. So I try to make it as easy as possible for you. So if you can do that, that makes a huge difference. If you can do a little more, if you can go for a visit and you do it on your lunch break, that's that's when you're kind of moving to the next level. If you can write, like, and think about where you're at and also take care of yourselves. I know Heidi and I were doing a lot of advocacy work a little bit ago, and she was like, you know what, we need to go to a winery and we need to relax. Make sure you're also taking comfort with your people and finding the people you trust and giving sharing that emotional load with them too. And I think,
100%. Put the oxygen mask on your face first,
yeah.
and you have to take care of yourself. And this is, I don't want it to seem like one more ask, but this is a very important ask for all of us. Stephanie, I can't thank you enough. It couldn't have gone any better, or you did it just like I fully expected you to do. And I'm even going to put you on the spot and say, as things get closer to heading towards the Senate or the Senate votes, can we please ask you back? We would love to have you back. Um, and I won't hold you to it, but I'm going to ask you. you know, you know me. I might ask you a few more times. I do want to. I'm very proud that the Down Syndrome Association of Atlanta and Gigi's have opted to do these kind of conversations. It's it's we're not trying to be bipartisan. We're not trying to do any of that. We're trying to make sure that your stories are getting told because we will be affected. Everybody's going to be affected by changes, and we're just trying to educate families. That is our main goal, is to make sure that y'all have the understanding of what potentially is happening. So thank you all for getting on the phone call. The SAA and Gigi's, y'all are very lucky because we work so closely together. And we're very lucky because we have people like Stephanie, who I think I called last Thursday and said, I think that we need this. So please follow her online on Facebook if you haven't already, or follow Heidi Moore under Unite Our Voices. But certainly reach out to each other, but give everybody grace. And if there's anything else that we can do for y'all in the future, we will have more conversations like this. And we will keep y'all posted. Thank you, Stephanie, so
I was gonna
much.
say, if they're gonna follow me on Facebook, go do Stephanie Hall Meredith, because there are a ton of Stephanie Merediths out there.
Oh,
But anyway, thank you so much,
thank
Cheryl.
y'all
for
so
all you
much.
do.
Take
Bye.
Fantastic. Bye bye.